Good morning, bon dia, buenos dias, bonjour. We are going to start in 1 minute, so please be seated. Good morning again. Welcome to the second day of the WLA-Club de Madrid Education for Shared Societies Policy Dialogue. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to the facilitator of this first plenary on Intergenerational Circle, and is Sarah Ziegler. She's program manager of Hedaya, one of our partners, and I would like to welcome her.
Thank you. Senhoras e senhores, bom dia. Obrigada pelo convite para moderar esta discussão. E também é prazer estar aqui em Lisboa, uma cidade muito linda. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, experts and colleagues, thank you to the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid for the invitation to facilitate this panel. I'm deeply honored to have been chosen. Thank you also to the Portuguese Republic and to the other organizers and sponsors, including the Gulbenkian Foundation for hosting us here at their beautiful premises. So I'm Sarah Ziegler. I'm the program manager for Hedaya, the International Center of Excellence for Countering Violent Extremism. And I also have the pleasure of being the working group leader on education for preventing violent extremism at this policy dialogue. And so I guess apologies to the Portuguese speakers, but apparently that was well received for my pronunciation. So as an American, I did not grow up learning a different language, but I'm very fond of the Portuguese language and I'm a student of it. So thank you for embracing my poor pronunciation. I'm particularly honored to be part of this discussion on this topic because I believe when it comes to education, youth need to be actively involved in determining the priorities for their own futures. And I'm happy that the subject of youth and their involvement in education and also in the security sector, which I'm more involved in, has become a priority amongst policymakers, including in forums such as this, but also at the United Nations through several Security Council resolutions recently. However, I want to draw our attention to the fact that involving youth in policy dialogues should not be done superficially. In the counterterrorism community, which is dominated by older men, let's be honest, I'm often invited to speak on panels because I'm both young and female. Well, of course, I appreciate that opportunity. I still want to make sure that my voice is heard because I'm relevant, and not just because I'm young or because I'm female. So in the same way, we need to ensure that youth are involved in this discussion on education, not just to check a box, but that they're actively and naturally part of that discussion on a regular basis. So I also have to admit that by some definitions, the organizers were actually quite lucky on the timing of this invitation, because as of tomorrow, I will no longer qualify as the youth category in some definitions. Thank you. At the same time, so I also think it's important to emphasize that we need to learn from the challenges and the successes and the failures of the generations that have come before. So in this respect, I think this format of this panel is incredibly important because this will be a discussion that will provide the opportunity for different individuals to speak about their experiences and perspectives in order to collaborate and find shared solutions. So before I open the panel for discussion, a few words on the format of this panel. I will start with one question that I will ask to all of the distinguished panelists here. And so I would ask that you respond in about 2 to 3 minutes to that first question to keep the answers relatively short. From there, I have a few other follow-up questions, but I think I want the conversation to flow naturally. So if you want to respond to another panelist, please get my attention and we'll have this more interactive conversation. And then at the end, if there's time, hopefully we will be able to open up the floor for questions from the audience. I think that's something we didn't really get to yesterday, so I think it would be great if we can get feedback from the audience. And in the same way, I would ask that you keep your remarks and your comments and questions to 2 to 3 minutes because we want to make sure that this is an open conversation. So on that note, I would like to introduce the panelists. We have Eloi Delman from Extremely Together and Kofi Annan Foundation. João Cuveneiro, the Deputy Mayor of Almada, Portugal. Nuwagaba Musin Kaduyu, the Director of Allied Muslim Youth Uganda. Zlatko Lagumdzija, the Prime Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2001 to 2002. Rosa Otunbayeva, President of the Kyrgyz Republic from 2010 to 2011. And José Manuel Ramos Horta, the President of Timor-Leste from 2007 to 2012. So with that, I would like to open the panel with the first question. So we all come from societies that are, in recent history, have experienced social tensions related to political, ethnic, religious, and economic fractures. In your experience, what is the role that education can play in bringing together divided societies? And at the same time, can education also play a negative role in dividing societies further? And what are the lessons learned from your experiences that we can avoid this? On that note, I will actually start on the very end with João, if that's fine with you. Please, 2-3 minutes.
So, good morning to you all, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm a teacher that was recently elected to a municipality, so I'm facing lots of challenges right now. To try to answer to your question, in Portugal, we don't have a real divided society. We have almost the same culture in every country, the same language, the same religion. So that problem, it's not very obvious in Portugal. The divided society is mainly on social and economical issues more than in cultural issues. So education, I'm sure, like in every other country, help us to bridge the gap between social groups and act like a social elevator for those who had less. And in 1974, the barriers between social groups were bigger, and I think in the last years we overcome some of those difficulties. Of course, sometimes education also reproduces social disadvantages, and we also can see that somehow in our schools. Some kids from families who have more rich backgrounds can go maybe further with more conditions, but I think education helped us to solve some of our problems. In 1974, when Portuguese people try to find jobs in other countries, they go for the worst jobs that there is, and right now we are fighting for the best positions. In 74, Portugal was almost politically irrelevant in the world scene, and now we have the Secretary General of the United Nations. So I think we overcome lots of challenges by education also.
Great, thank you. And Rosa?
Preparing myself to this meeting, I found that there is no rigorous research about conflict and education. I do believe that it should be like which we have seen accountability in education, and last year was learning of the World Bank, and so on and so on. So this is a serious point to my mind. Going through conflict in my country, in Kyrgyzstan, certainly, I do believe that education heals the wounds, education makes enlightenment in the heads of people, and facing tremendous challenges which my nation goes through, we certainly rely on education. And I found that a very firm thesis today is during the war, education should not stop. It should go on and on. And education only spots are the, such places for stability, and having found that only 1% of aid goes for education out of humanitarian aid, I was frustrated tremendously. So, I mean, education is critically important. Education only we can overcome all sorts of difficulties. Look at after 2 wars in Europe, we have France and Germany just like twins, let's say, brothers countries. And we look up at this example when we are talking about our conflicts back in our countries. So I can really give vital information to my nation when we are talking about the conflicts.
Thank you very much. And I think you drew on an important point, is the need for more research. And coming from the research department, I get excited when senior policymakers actually say we need more research, because you're right. We need to know what's happening, especially in a conflict situation, and what's happening with education, and where education can fill a gap, maybe where other avenues cannot fill that gap for those children. Zlatko, can you reflect on the question, please?
Education that I grew up with, and I was educated in a time when I was technically speaking educated. When I say technically speaking, because we used to see education as something that you go to school when you're 7 years old, when you're 22, 23, if you graduate then you're finito. Maybe if you are some kind of weird professor, then you go for PhD or something like that. That's the way it used to be. So at that time, education was about skills and about knowledge. Today, what we are talking about, it's about education for values and for character. That's not usual in my time. That was not the role of education, to actually teach and preach character and values. That was given to the religious communities, to the families, to maybe states in ideological sense and so on. But actually, the education was focused on how to make living, how to do knowledge and skills, and how to master that. We are living in a time in which, basically speaking, we have to definitely shift completely that. And education has to be more and more about the values and character that it ever used to be. Because of a very simple reason. Without education, and especially it applies to the conflict and post-conflict parts of the world. Because if you leave education for knowledge and skills, you will just have as a result the more strong and more powerful people who actually are going to use that knowledge and that power in maybe a wrong way. So that leads me to the conclusion, very simple one, that the role of education, especially in post-conflict parts of the world, is much more should be focused on values and character. And I'll give you a very concrete example from my country. 27, 8 years ago, when the war stopped, we had 3 educational systems, segregated educational systems on 3 parts of the country, under domination of one or second or third ethnic or religious group. We had 3 armies, of course, at the same time. So if someone will pass you a question, what would be integrated fastest? It will say, of course, education is a piece of cake. I mean, who would be say that we will integrate armies that were killing each other until yesterday? Today, we have 1 army, but we still have 3 segregated educational systems. And we are actually educating the soldiers for the 3 armies. So that's kind of paradox that we have to think about. That, and the last point, I learned a lesson from my old professor who used to be prime minister when I was serving in one government. And he was telling me, because he's professor, man of knowledge, and he was always saying that we have to pay attention more on education, because when you get into government, education ministries and education as an issue is, as he used to call, cold ministry, compared to the hot ministries. Hot ministries are ministries that you have to respond immediately, because crises are, but education ministry was hot only when teachers go to strike. So we have to flip the coin to a certain extent, to see that education is, by definition, the hottest ministry, because we are actually putting the seeds for something that may grow in wrong direction. So, and I just want to congratulate you for pronouncing my name, because I told you just forget the letters, just pronounce my name, and you obviously forgot the letters because you pronounced my name perfectly, almost as well as I did.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I think you drew on an important point that I actually want to get back to in a few minutes in the discussion. You mentioned that values and character should be part of the next generation of education. And so my question for the panel to think about as we keep going down the line here on the first question, but something to think about and keep in mind, is it possible to have shared values? And what are those shared values that we want to inculcate our next generation with? So if we're teaching certain values, what values are universal that we can draw upon? So something to think about here for the next few minutes. But in the meantime, Muhsin, would you go ahead and respond to the first
thank
question?
you so much, Sarah, and greetings, everyone. I convey sincere regards and greetings from Uganda, the part of Africa. So to go straight to your question about the importance of education in transforming communities, I come from a community that is multi-ethnic, and we've had conflicts, serious conflicts, identity conflicts actually, and we've seen the power of education in transforming the communities, because we've gone to schools with people that initially were not talking to each other, communities that have fought with each other, but we've shared schools with the kids of people who are fighting each other. So we see that education really plays an important role in shaping our characters, in understanding who we are, shaping our identities, and feeling, getting a sense of belonging. When you talk about inclusion, having that sense of belonging, feeling that, yeah, this is my country, I must do something to transform it. But at the same time, we've seen that education can really play a very serious negative role, especially just like, driving under the influence of alcohol. You know, if education is in the hands of people who really don't care, in most cases we are bound to hit a dead end. I'll give you an example of academic research, for example. If there is no academic freedom in an environment where people are supposed to share ideas, ideas are supposed to come out because of maybe fear of political repression or political persecution, you know, people fear to come up with new ideas. Academics, you know, research brings up new ideas, for example, at universities. But then if people are fearful to talk about peace, to talk about these issues because you do not want to hear certain issues being discussed, then that is oppression. Then we're not going to experience the beauty of education in transforming communities. So I believe it can be used to transform communities, especially in shaping both actually formal and informal education. And I actually think more education happens in informal education systems than even in formal education systems. So I believe that we can do much because it transforms communities. People try to understand one another, especially value-based education. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think, again, you brought up some important points, especially in connecting the formal education sector to the informal education sector, and also providing some background on your context in Uganda. Ilhan, would you go ahead and respond to the first question?
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. On the question on can education support in divided societies, I come from arguably one of the most divided societies. I'm from Somalia, a country that's been in conflict for my whole life, the last 28 years. We are divided by borders, by tribe, by different factions that are regional authorities in different places, by terrorist organizations. So my community is incredibly divided. But the problem that supersedes all of that is that education has not been really used as a tool for peace building because it's a commodity. Education is still 100% privatized in Somalia. It is a luxury, it is for those that can afford it, and all of the educational services that are provided are from nonprofits, UN agencies, humanitarian organizations, and there isn't a national standard yet. There's been a lot of work that's been done on developing the curriculum, but been contested. And so at the national level, education is not really being used as a tool for conflict resolution right now. And it's a big shame because we see in my work that it does have a transformative potential for actually creating social cohesion. It has transitional justice aims. It brings communities together, and I believe strongly in the power of education. In my work on the disengagement and reintegration of young people leaving armed groups, education is the key tool that we use to not only support the individual recovery of people that are coming from armed groups, but also for them to be welcomed back into their societies. It's an entry point. It's a tool for dialogue. And what we see in Somalia is that this is all one generation young. The conflict has been ongoing for 28 years, but before, during the dictatorship in Somalia, before the civil war that happened, we had a huge national campaign in 1975 that was very successful. I think one of the most successful educational campaigns for literacy in Africa, where all of the young people that were in universities had to go to the rural communities. They had to go and teach nomads how to read and write, and that integrated societies. It abolished the hierarchy that is insinuated by tribalism. So it has become a tool in the past, and it could be again for bringing societies together. Another initiative that I'm a part of, that the capacity I'm speaking on here today for Extremely Together, which was started by the Kofi Annan Foundation, bringing young people from around the world together to prevent violent extremism. We've used education as the key tool for actually inoculating communities against preventing violent extremism. And that has been transformative in Somalia. It's been in Uganda, where we did workshops, in South Sudan, done roadshows throughout Europe. And the idea has been to work and partner with schools to teach value-based lessons to young people on how to be peaceful within, to live in peace. So I definitely believe that education can bring societies together, and I wish that there was more of a deliberate and intentional focus on affording this in countries in conflict as well, and not as just something that we prioritize post-conflict. As the former president from Madam Rosa has said, during war, education should not stop. And this is not something that we're seeing right now in conflict zones. Human rights has always been a nice box to tick, but during conflict, it's not prioritized.
Thank you very much, and that's a great point about making sure that access to quality education is not a privileged privilege, and that it's a basic human right. And so now I'll turn the floor to Jose, if you could reflect on the first question that I asked to the panel.
Well, allow me to maybe to be a bit blunt and controversial, particularly in such a brotherhood, sisterhood atmosphere. As I listened yesterday to today on education, I cannot but help thinking of the failure, miserable failure of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, in what concerns education. If you look at the experience of South Korea, Singapore, then in the north, Finland, or Costa Rica, it's not a huge discovery on our part how education has played incontrovertible, indispensable role in the transformation of these countries. As much as national leaders in our respective countries might want to invest more and more on education, and many of us, they do. In my country, we have done that over the years. Our partners in development miserably failed that over the last 50 years. If, after World War II, after the stabilization of Europe, and when Europe becomes an ODA provider, had more money spent on education of our peoples in the Maghreb region, in North Africa, well, you wouldn't have people fleeing, so it's utter failure, because education is not very sexy, quote unquote, like building a bridge and then you inaugurate it, because it takes too long in education. And let me give you an example, ladies and gentlemen. In 2002, at my country's independence, we had 19 medical doctors. I was foreign minister at that time. I was the one who went around begging for scholarships, begging for money, for budget assistance. Most donor countries don't like budget assistance, they like program assistance, etc., etc. Well, today we have over 1,000 medical doctors. Thanks to whom? Not to ODA, but to little Cuba. I talked to Fidel Castro, my colleagues talked to Fidel Castro. First, the Cubans sent doctors to us. I remember a conversation with Fidel. He said, we should set up a medical school in your country. And I didn't say that, but I said, God, does Fidel knows what a medical school means? And because he always talked passionately. Well, we do have a medical school now, starting in 2006. We send 700 medical students to Cuba, all return to continue studies. So now we have about 1,000. In terms of per capita, one of the highest. Now we are sending them out to do master's degrees, to do specialization. And our government has spent, since 2009, $30 million a year on what we call human capacity development. We sent, in one go, 100 students to Thailand, to the best universities in Thailand, which we handpicked and pay all by us. Philippines, 100. I was pleasantly surprised the other day talking with our ambassador here in Portugal. She said we have more than 1,000 Timorese students here. And the majority on their own, their families paying for it, which also means, God, the incredible purchasing power You know, how our families, our people getting more money, paying for the schools here. So we have majority paid by the families, second by our own government, and third by Portugal. I have to say, you know, to clarification, Portugal is one of the very few countries that never argue about budget support. Always provide budget support if we want, we ask them. Many different countries over it, because even Sweden, the most humanitarian of all, declined to provide budget support. The British, flexible, even Washington, we managed to make them flexible, but most is like, because we can talk all about education, you know, inclusive education for shared society, but above all, our people in the developing world need skills so that they can survive in the job market, whether at home or abroad. As we are in this global economy where you, in Europe, aging societies, you are getting old, Europeans, North Americans, you need labor, and the labor provided by many of us, but labor that should have skills so that they do not just, you know, go and cleaning, sweeping streets. And of course, what I'm very, very impressed, pleased to do, in my own country, 10 years ago, we have a sovereign fund from oil and gas that we have. We immediately set up a sovereign fund, considered one of the best managed in Asia, the third best in the world. It was Norwegians, our friends in Norway, who taught us, advised us on how to set up a sovereign fund. 10 years ago, almost everyone working there, managing our sovereign fund, were foreigners. A few months ago, I went to visit our sovereign fund operation. Everyone there were Timorese, with master's degrees in Singapore, in Europe, and everywhere. So, and this is what education is, empowering our people to compete, to survive, to win in the global market.
Thank you very much. I think that was an excellent example of a very small investment in education that turned out to be transformative in your society. Rosa, would you like to respond?
Can I just continue for one idea? I think when we are talking about the international aid towards to education, especially, which is always very scarce, I think we must also speak about the accountability of international organizations, and especially those who are engaged with education. So we have a couple of such bodies, institutions, Commission of Brown, another our fellow member of Club de Madrid, former Australian Prime Minister, she leads another such a foundation. So I think there is a gap on the accountability of those organizations also, and including all the IFIs. We do know that you are talking about the values, and it's not necessarily it comes through texts. It might come through art, for example, and no organization gives money for art. It looks like the whole developing world is doesn't have a creativity at all. I mean, we should just learn skills, learn new knowledge, and to be a good labor force for the world. So, with this regard, I do believe that accountability of international organizations, this is also imperative.
I think that's an important point, and I think my colleagues from East Africa would agree with me that there's a lot of creativity in countries that don't necessarily produce art on a regular basis, but if you go there, there's a big art scene when it comes to fashion, when it comes to pottery, when it comes to clothes, and so it's not true, of course, that there's no creativity in the developing world. So I want to get back.
Talking about the support of art
Absolutely.
in developing countries.
Absolutely.
Not just we don't have
exactly.
arts,
so I agree with you. I think so. We need to cultivate that, and we need to grow that and showcase that internationally. So absolutely agree with that point. So I want to get back to my question earlier. So I think we can possibly all agree that education is a political tool in some ways because it helps to build nations. But nations have their own identities and their own cultures and their own languages. So again, getting back to that question of what are the shared values and what are the shared skills that we need to develop in our next generation. So if you could reflect on that, does anybody have a first reflection, first answer?
Well, based on my humble, modest experience, I would say, each of us have our own experiences. You in Somalia, in Uganda, friends from the Balkans, and each of us have to design our own policies, strategies on how through education to heal our communities that were, one of the, I would say, the greatest success in my country has been in national reconciliation. And unlike the case with South Africa, for instance, was always talked about as a model of reconciliation, led, inspired by Mandela. But in South Africa, it was primarily the need for internal reconciliation among South Africans, black and white. In Timor-Leste, we had to do national reconciliation among Timorese, because not everybody were on one side. It would be too dishonest or simplistic to say, all the bad in one side, Indonesia, and all the, no. So we did first national reconciliation. Second, we had to do reconciliation with Indonesia, how to bridge a country like Timor-Leste, 98% Catholic, victim, with Indonesia, largest Muslim majority in the world, that was our aggressor. Well, you also, and it was relatively easy for us because throughout our struggle for independence, that's why I say we have different experience. Never once in my country, in our struggle for independence, we demonize the other side, whether they as a people or they as a religion. So never, no researcher ever since independence have been able to find a single page of our official propaganda that demonize Muslims. Never. Or demonize Indonesians as a people. So it was not a matter of, after independence, you switch off, No, so when you indoctrinate people to serve a purpose, well, then it's very difficult to change. So that's what, based on our history, our practice, never to demonize it. So we're also able to incorporate back in our police force. 60% of our police force, when we started, were people who collaborated with the other side. They were police on the other side. And then, of course, new generation came in the last 16 years. You go to our parliament, I don't want to mention names, but they looked at a bunch full of people who some would identify as having collaborated with the other side. And some even say we exaggerate on the reconciliation. And we, then last point, and we resisted the advice, pressure, sometimes from some friends in Washington, in the US Congress, UN, Amnesty International, that we should pursue international justice to try those who collaborate with the. Our side, we refuse. So we didn't go to set up an international tribunal on East Timor to try. No. And the other side, so Indonesia, they appreciated it. And we said, we understand that Indonesia also was a victim of the Cold War, victim of the post-Vietnam, and fragile democracy, the transition from dictatorship to democracy. So you have to understand that. And that's why also, ladies and gentlemen, I know Myanmar like few people. And I'm puzzled when I hear the Human Rights Council in Geneva, ICC, all talking about Myanmar. Not to mention the hypocrisy, selectivity of the powers. So extraordinarily complex situations, how you assist elected people, communities, to transition from dictatorship, from tyranny, from the past, to democracy. It's very difficult, ups and downs. And education has a part in it. Education is not only the formal education. Education, yes, through cinema, through art, through music, education in the communities, after hours. But during hours, well, we have to provide the tools of knowledge to succeed in the global market. But after hours, plenty of time. And that's what we do. I did it personally, after hours. I launched a program called Delhi City of Peace. That after 10 years, 15 years, when conditions are met, criteria that we laid out, the city is declared by law Delhi City of Peace. And that not only that no violence, but also that actually in French there is a better expression, société solidaire, when we have created a solidarity society. Meaning what? That we respect, support elderlies, handicapped people, but also refugees. In my conversation with communities, I tell our people, we should be the last people in the world to turn our back on refugees. We even have a refugee, we are a poor country, although much better now. We also have refugees. And I refuse to use the word illegal migrants. Only a Martian arriving on Earth, we can say, sorry, sir, you are an illegal on this planet. So, to say a human being, you are an illegal. Oh God, I hate that. But to make it simpler, he's a legal migrant, just for purpose of discussion. But I tell our people, because we have even Bangladeshis in my country. Why on earth someone from a village in Bangladesh would end up in Timor-Leste?
So I think you made some really great points here, and if you don't mind, I'm going to stop you a little bit just so that we can hear some other perspectives on the panel. But I think one thing I picked up on your remarks here was that not demonizing the other, so still creating that sense of identity for your own country, but not making the other the enemy, and creating that empathy with the other countries that you're dealing with. So I think Joao had a few points to make, but I also want to ask Ilwad to respond to the question of, especially you mentioned the campaign in Somalia in the 70s, and so if you could do that campaign again, what are the values and skills in Somalia that you would want the next generation to cultivate? So I'll let you think about that while Joao will respond.
I would like to underline something that Rosa said. It's the idea of education not as a tool only to transform young people in working material, but the need of education to develop the whole human being, all his dimensions, and I think that is very important because as probably we all know, the most interesting part of each one of us are not the things that we do when we work. It's our other dimensions. The higher order thinking skills, for instance, they are connected with things like creativity, like she was saying. So I think one thing very important is start to look to education not only as a way to provide workers to industry or to agriculture or to but the development of the human being in all his dimensions. To answer to your question about the values, if we can find global values, of course, things like honesty are present in every civilization and in every culture. Things like the peace, the relevance of peace, and prepare us to be in peace with each other. Even courage, the courage to defend our ideas, that is something that everybody understands. The value of liberty and the opportunity of each of us determine itself. And also values like kindness, I think they are appreciated in every culture and every civilization. Of course, we have to develop skills and competencies like collaborate with each other, communicate, develop critical thinking and attitudes like empathy, resilience, commitment, flexibility. But the values, I think most of them are real global, those values that I said before.
Great. So, Ilad, if you could respond. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, not at all. So, just before I answer the question on how I would roll out the campaign on literacy in Somalia in this day and age, on your point of what are the shared values or what we need to do to develop the next generation through education, is that a lot of young people today globally don't feel that education or this type of education they're getting is serving them in this era. It's outdated. It's not really preparing them for that transition between youthhood to adulthood. It's skills that you memorize and you go through the motions just to get degrees and accolades, but it doesn't actually prepare you to be the well-rounded person that you need to do to survive in the world that we all live in today, whether it's in conflict, post-conflict, or the developed world. So young people, they want opportunities to express political dissent safely in schools. They want to be critical thinkers. They care about issues like climate change. They want to have dialogue with their teachers and not just sit somewhere and memorize. And for most of the developing world, in Africa particularly, we are still learning about the history of the colonizers. We are not hearing about our own history. In Somalia today, with an overwhelming majority of young people, more than 80% of the population is under the age of 30. 56% of that is under the age of 15. It is a country of children. And they're not even learning about their own history, but they're learning the history of the Italians, and in the north they're learning about the British. And it's part of that is, how are you supposed to know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from? So in order for education to actually prepare young people, for them to care about issues like governance and democracy and global ideals and these shared values that we've been talking about yesterday and today, schools and the curriculum need to actually prepare them. And that comes from teachers that are trained, that create safe spaces for young people to actually have that kind of opportunity. And I would also add to that education needs to be more outside of the formal sector. It needs to be within the community. It needs to have internships. People need to be able to interact with world leaders as we are in this forum and learn and debate together, and job shadowing and mentorship should be an integral element of that, so that you don't have to fend for yourself only after you get your degree. So this is something that we're hearing a lot, and there's very few examples where the overwhelming majority of those that are not from privileged backgrounds can even access such opportunities. So if I had the opportunity to roll out a campaign that focuses on literacy or building communities through education, like that was done in the 70s in Somalia, that was very successful, I would instill what I just talked about now, go into communities and providing free education, but quality education that is rights-based as well too. So, and this is something that we've done in Somalia, where we were working with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence and working with mothers and girls, and instead of them teaching them A for apple, we teach them, you know, H for human rights or something, so that they are both learning literacy but also learning their own rights throughout that. And I think the opportunity as well too in countries that are still affected by a lot of very high literacy rates is that it has to be more adaptive, and taking into account that even in populations where people didn't have access to education, there is a lot of illiteracy, people still live and survive. They're still trading. Women that are mothers and caring for entire communities are owning shops, and they're trading, and they know how to, you know, make money and do business, but they didn't go to school. So how do you actually take people's lived experiences and integrate that into new curriculums? Yeah.
I think there's so many great points in there. So, Zlatko, did you have a comment as well? I think you were trying.
Very briefly, I think that when it comes to what are the shared values, I think it's a fundamental thing to understand and to share among us. But even more important is why that matters. Because I think we will very easily agree about what are the shared values among us. Especially, I mean, when you don't know what to say, the best way is to say something which is well known. And this is old rule that you can find in the book of every major religion. Don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. So that's basically speaking the fundamental principle that we are building up everything upon that. But why that matters, that's what we have to disseminate and broadcast much more. And maybe the good example is how we started 10, 11 years ago with Share Society Project. We first started with outbound commitments, where we explained what it is. And basically speaking, we said that it's nice to be nice. What we said, it's better to have shared society than segregated society. And we were on the moral axis of it. And that's how you start. You have to show that it is morally right. Then what we did, next thing is, we made a little, very practical project, Economics of Shared Society, that it does pay dividend. It is much more profitable to live in a shared society than live in a segregated society. So that's how we should, in order to mobilize people, you have to sell them why. And why can have two things, positive and negative. Positive economics of it, and negative is we are actually driving the truck directly to hit the big wall without it. So you have to have hope scenario and scary scenario if you don't go in that direction. So I think that we should see how we can disseminate this, why this is relevant. And last point, inequality is the magic word today. You can make discussion about inequality in economic sense, social sense and everything. I think that inequality in education is one of the key words that can get the ears. Because inequality in education is something that can mobilize us a lot and can a big, good argument. Inequality in every sense, not only in the sense of everyone can go to Harvard, or maybe the second rate would go to Stanford. But I mean, it's not about, or vice versa, I don't know, it depends which coast you like. I mean, the weather in Stanford is definitely better. But my point is very simple. Today, inequality in education, in fundamental basic education, it's growing to unprecedented scale. Because right now, according to the last, and I'll finish with that, UN data survey is saying that population of UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal together is smaller number of people than how many kids today are out of the school. And in order to somehow tackle that gap, we need in the next 10 years about population of France of new teachers. So that inequality is going in absolutely suicidal direction. So these are the things that we have to a little bit more underline in order to mobilize people about what do we want to do. Because I'm sure that we know what we want to do, but how to mobilize people.
I think those are great points, actually, and I think this we have to both advocate for the positive, but also scare people into what could happen, the negative consequences if we don't build a stronger shared society. Muhsin, did you want to respond? And then I think we'll possibly open the floor for a few comments from the audience as well.
Thank you so much. I will actually just add to my sisters. We all come from different contexts, with different experiences. So every community will come up with, a goal that this is what we want in the future, in the next years to come. In Uganda, we have Vision 2040. We talk about all these visions. So it depends on what kind of achievement that we want to get, in the coming years. But at the same time, we all agree that when it comes to building peace, because all we want a peaceful world, it means we must build peace-loving men. And if we want to build a shared society that we talk about, we must be willing to build individuals who are willing to share, individuals who are willing to understand that you are my brother, you are my sister, but not just to compete, because our education system teaches us how to compete. It teaches us how to be better than each other, like I'm better than you. But we must talk about values that we share, that we all win at the end of the day. That if you're living in a better place, I am going to help you remain in it. And I'm also feeling good if you're happy. So we must all talk about these values that we share as human beings, values of love, tolerance, respect. I come from a background where we are too religious. Our country is so religious. People have different religions and they all believe in God. But then our goal would be a spiritual one, that what we want is a community where we all love one another. We share, in the same spirit. We love each other. We hold hand in hand in terms of challenges, and then we move together. But then we have challenges that come, when it comes to achieving that. That when we come to politicians, for example, are we training young people or the next generation? Like we always say, we are training the next generation, but are we training them for future societies? We are teaching them, because like today we are here, our parents taught us saying that we are the next generation. Now we are teaching others saying that they are the next generation, but the future societies, are they ready to be part of that society? Because it's a shared society. It's a globalized community. There's free flow of information. How are we training our students today to share information and to receive information as well? So issues of love, values of love and tolerance, respect for diversity. Me, I come from an Islamic background, so I'll say, in the Quran where it says, we created you in nations and tribes so that you can know each other. So the goal of education as well, because it brings people together, it must be to get to know one another, to get to respect each other. And then how do we transform communities? Because that's what we do actually with our projects that we do in Uganda with the Student Connectors Network. It's an interfaith platform for young people. They come together, we give them these skills in understanding each other, respect for diversity, so that these are skills they don't get in class, because teachers don't care. They're also, not motivated enough to talk about peace or even anything. So how do we transform our communities in that purpose? So if we really want to build shared societies, we must be willing to create individuals who are willing to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think from here, we're going to open the floor for comments or questions from the audience. Please keep your comments or questions very short. We don't have so much time left, so I do want to make sure that we can get a couple of questions in. Is there anybody that has a comment or a question? We have one over here.
Thanks. I just wanted to, pick up the point that about both aid and educational exclusion. We're talking about education for said societies, but probably the single biggest challenge to that is educational exclusion and the remaining children who are out of school. Further to that, I think that it's very important to recognise that lots of kids go to school but don't learn very much. So we know that about 262 million children around the world will complete grade 4 but won't be able to read at the basic level. So we have both exclusion from education and exclusion in education. And if children aren't learning the most basic things, just the ability to read basic text, it's hard to think about how education is contributing to exclusion. Somalia is a good example too. Only 40% of children get to go to primary school in Somalia. And if you move outside of urban areas, it reduces to 20%. And then the final point I wanted to make is to reinforce President Ramos Horta's point about aid to education, which we've really failed on. And if you look at that and recognise that there's a failure there, it gets worse when you think about aid in humanitarian crises, which we've also been talking about. Aid to education in humanitarian crisis receives less than 2% of all of the aid that's provided. It's the poor cousin of an underfunded system. And yet, the vast majority of exclusion and poor learning outcomes are in post-conflict states. So this is a really significant challenge that we need to address for this issue of education for shared societies.
Great, thank you so much. I think those are some excellent points, and just drawing our attention again to the number of youth that are out of school. I think we have another question or comment down here.
Yes, I think that amongst the environments in which children are taught, the family is to be taken in account, because it's the permanent teaching through example, through good relationship with the parents and the grandparents also. So nobody mentioned it, but I think education begins at home. And for instance, learning to say thank you and please, which is the basic thing, begins at home. And of course, the good relationship between teachers and parents is one very important factor. To be more or less in the same rhythm, but the real education, the values are learned at home, either through the religion of the family, traditions, or the way that father and mother treat each other, and how the subjects they speak about in the dinner table. If you only speak about money and about the other people's lives, you're not educating. If you're speaking about your country, the traditions, you are preparing the earth, the soil, to be sown by teachers afterward.
Excellent point. And this, I was thinking about this yesterday actually, is connecting families and parents with teachers and making sure that they're in sync with each other when we're talking about cultivating values in students and their own children. It also made me think about what about educating parents in general? So I think, Zlatko, you mentioned that actually education, the word education used to just be learning knowledge, but now we're thinking of it in a very different way. It's a more lifelong learning process. And so if we're all still learning, if parents are still learning, what about educating parents on cultivating values in their own kids? So just something, food for thought to think about. Rosa, if you want to.
Sarah, we are at the policy dialogue of the Madrid Club. So, and my peers are here, and I want to raise this issue about the Madrid Club's place and role in this topic, education. I do believe that our voice should be heard. It's not just talking club that we have discussed in depth this issue, and with participation of so many experts from around the world. But it seems to me we should probably produce also such messages to the world about these topics. Yesterday's labs give me hope that we are close to action, not just general truth, which each of us we know about, but we can really produce some form, some action, and some pious, President Sampaio's such a challenge. His appeal is so important and so concrete. And with this regard, I think this migration issue, I would say about this, otherwise I would leave again this topic with some guilt in my heart. As members of such a democratically elected former presidents and prime ministers, when we have this crisis in Europe, migration and Europe, so unfortunately we don't outvoice our position regarding this very sharp, acute situation in Europe. Look, only Mrs. Merkel should stay there alone, or Soros should be under the knee in front of the nationalists and so on. So where is reasonable intellectuals, not just the kamikaze publicists, but all of us, and including Madrid Club. So these migration issues, we should not forget that we are in this Gulbenkian's foundation. And I understand Gulbenkian, he was a sort of refugee who came to this country. Another foundation which we have seen, AKDN, which were Ismailis, been refugees also. So, and why today's people who run Europe, why all these nationalists, they do think that they say the last truth in the world. And it's very difficult, very hard to abstain to them. But nevertheless, seems to me we must also consolidate our voice and make to be heard this voice. And another point regarding yesterday's discussion about the digital teaching and risks, I don't think, look, risks, it is very important, and digital, the cyber security is very important. I do share this knowledge. But at the same time, I think we should not forget that we have 260 million, as it was now mentioned. Those children completely out of school. There is numbers in all the developing countries. People can't read, can't calculate, and so on. So there is endless work to teach digital education for those children, people generally, for the whole developing world. And I think it relates also to developed world also. So, I mean, not just this talks about these risks with the cyber security, which certainly relates to all of the world, but still teaching and this good news which we heard yesterday, that someone wants to put this technique in cosmos, that it will let all schools to be connected to internet. That's really a good news, which I'm leaving this conference with.
Great, great. Thank you so much. I think it's really important that you drew our attention to what this forum can bring to this topic. And so I hope that there's some commitments that come after this in terms of advocacy or funding from Club de Madrid members, because you have vast networks and access to the right people. So I'm glad to hear that you're calling for that action as well. So I think we have time for just 3 more comments. We had one in the corner here, and then in the front here, and then in the back, and then we'll have to conclude. So keep your remarks short, please.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for your wise words and for allowing us to hear this fruitful debate. And throughout these 2 days, I've noticed something. You've made relevant 2 of the most important problems, which is not to instrumentalize education and the lack of government and otherwise funding for it. So if we need to people to see that education is a good in itself, not a good for a means, for an end, it is an end in itself. How can we stop and prevent from education being instrumentalized by someone who does not share these values that we are talking about? Thank you.
Great question. And so there's, I think, a comment here and then one in the back, and then we'll wrap up.
So thank you. I think the two issues. One is the parents, what has been mentioned here. Of course, it would be nice if everybody would have a very good and progressive parents, but they have not. And this is a difficulty, of course, between the teachers and the students. But one thing what we have tried, so I say it's just one example, we have tried in Finland is that when we have had a very strong movement inside the country, and so the grandparents are not present physically because they are somewhere else. So we have organized in such a way that the schools and daycare centers, preschool education systems, they can have a common grandmother or grandfather. And I don't say that they are better, they can even be worse, of course, but they have time to listen, and they have seen already the result of their own kids, that what they have done with raising up these methods. And then I do believe in adult education in that sense, that if the teachers have a good communication, and you can try it at least, it's not expensive to invite somebody to be a grandmother or grandfather of the preschool education center or at school, and then it's very interesting, this system also between then the grandparents and parents, that of course it's nice not to disturb the family, but if the kids say that, the teacher said, and even the granny tells that it could be right. So I mean that it can continue the discussion. The second point, Rosa said very well, that we could be also, when we are the Club de Madrid, we could be also the parents or grandparents of the society. So we shouldn't be too shy to say our opinions, for instance, concerning the human rights or the xenophobia or the refugees. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the first example of grandparents, it's a great concrete example for us to take home. And one last comment or point in the back, and then I'm afraid we have to conclude.
Thank you. I'm struck by how we often get stuck on the nature of the problem and where we are, as opposed to the vision of what we should have. And I just want to sort of put a reality check here. 3 years ago, the Saudis pumped millions of dollars into India to set up 4 Wahhabi universities in India. When you pump money into setting up 4 new universities, you have a vision of what it is that you're trying to achieve, right? And so my challenge, and I want to come back to what Rosa said, as the Club de Madrid, if the issue is a policy, high-level policy dialogue, what is the vision that we should be, and we could be helping you to articulate out there? And I just wanted to sort of maybe mention 3 points. Number one is the question of the ODA, increasing ODA for education or the budgets, but education and in the humanitarian setting. Number two is what I mentioned yesterday, the idea of a national social service that already exists in some context, but to really generate that and make it something that within each country we have that as a way of fostering social cohesion and the skills and the kinds of it and the kind of practical experiences that people want. And the third is, why should we be talking about Harvard and Stanford? What I'd like to do is in 5 years' time come back and be told that the medical school that you want to get into is the one in Timor-Leste. So this idea that we're constantly looking at the US or Oxford or Cambridge, forget it. Why can't it be in our own countries? Right? That's the way we should be thinking about it, because when we send our kids abroad, that money is also going to the endowment of Harvard and Stanford. And trust me, they don't need our money. Right? So it's to bring it back and to think about why we can't have centers of excellence across the world in each of the continents and countries that we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we're on the same page. Yeah, I think unfortunately we have to wrap up because we have to move into the next session. So I'm sorry. 1 minute to the panel? Okay, yeah, so I was going to conclude with allowing the panelists just 30 seconds to 1 minute only, please, to any final thoughts that you have, and then I'll wrap up.
So very fast, how to avoid the instrumentalization of education. I think we should empower teachers, allow them to be autonomous and to be flexible in the way they teach, addressing answers to the local problems, to empower the communities, and I think that will be the best way to avoid that education would be instrumentalization tool of a religion or a party, and so teachers matter, and we should empower teachers.
Great, thank you. Rosa?
I think, again, Madrid Club, we should finalize all this discussion. And so we are not discussing every year education. So, and summarize this discussion and really think about for the issue, what will be our role and landmark in this very important topic, education.
Well, in a time in which we are, as we all know, we are teaching the new generations for the jobs that we have no clue how the jobs will look like, giving them knowledge that we know that will be obsolete by the time they start implementing it, and they will be working with technologies that haven't been invented. So in such an environment, in such a changing world, it is the key to stick to the values and to the vision that we want to achieve, vision as a set of the goals that we are going for. If that is so, then obviously I think that we have to just be positive about it, we have to believe in it, we have to be passionate about it, and we should not forget that us, who are professors, have to be more students than we used to be. So we all have to be spreading the culture that all of us are more than ever needed to be students and learning again in order to pass that knowledge to the students that we are working with. So keep being student.
Thank you so much. I would like to end up by calling upon all people, because we are all stakeholders, especially when it comes to education reforms, to really be genuine, especially the politicians, to be genuine about what exactly we want. Are we just teaching for statistics? Do we really teach, educate for just the sake of educating, or we really have a goal? We are educating our next generation very well. So we must really accept the fact that young people must also be involved in all these processes. We must get them involved to ensure that they own these processes, because they must love them. You cannot just, because the current education system just shouts at people. It shouts at students. I'm sorry, for lack of a better word maybe, but it just shouts at us, and we have nothing to do but just go through the system. So I call upon the stakeholders to really be willing to take the necessary steps. And of course, you'll get some uncomfortable truths, but be ready to listen. Politicians care about the votes. But trust me, if you educate the students well, you will get the votes as well. So let's educate the students well. We'll get a shared society.
Well, I think everything has already been said. I think that the last 2 days really have been about co-creating solutions. It's been, we've done a lot of work on, I mean, in the working groups and the discussions and the action labs that we had yesterday on the policies that we want to actually reform education. And I'm just very keen to see what's next. What's next, and hopefully we will be able to match the resources to the rhetoric and, you know, collectively actually create something tangible.
As a former president, and I also always like to think that we former presidents have an enormous influence, and which we don't. Some maybe do, depends on our relationships in our own countries, but to the extent possible, I will obviously, I have read, learned a lot about the Shared Society project. It is obviously, it is a Bible almost, well, pardon for my Christian or Quran or any spiritual religious document. We will work with it on my side. In my little village, Timor-Leste is a village of the world. I will continue to debate on what the best education for our society, of our people, the best in every sense, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping your answers short. I will just wrap up, actually. As we've been having these discussions here, I've been jotting down a few points for this shared vision, I think that Sanam mentioned. So in terms of values, we mentioned things like empathy, honesty, creativity, courage, self-confidence, liberty and opportunity, kindness. And then in terms of skills, we mentioned, I think, ability to adapt to new technologies was a really great point because we're in a changing world. Critical thinking skills, skills for discussion and making sure that learning environments create that safe space. So from here, this is our quick summary of the vision that we've created so far. And so my challenge to you now is how we're going to implement that. So how are we going to take that forward? And I look forward to the next panel discussion that can hopefully have some answers to that. So thank you, obrigada.
So we will continue now with the next session. We are going to change the stage and continue.
Great job, I'm sure.
Thank you. Okay, if you can be seated, we are going to start in 1 minute. Fácilmente movibles, los miembros y tal, sí. Okay, so we are here, this is here, Sean. at the end of the session. Okay. So we will, hello, good morning again. So we will continue now with Plenary 4, crafting an agenda on education for shared societies. Sanan referred to the need to have a vision, and the vision from this policy dialogue will be channeled into this agenda. It will be an agenda that the World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid will work in the next few weeks with all the contributions of the preparatory work of the policy dialogue, but also on the feedback and the ideas that have been shared these 2 days in Lisbon. So I would like to give the floor first to King Campbell, former Prime Minister of Canada and World Leadership Club de Madrid member, but also on the panel we will have the honor to have as contributors 2 persons who has been key for this preparatory work and for the agenda that we are going to build. Pedro Cunha, Deputy Director, Programa Gulbenkian Conocimiento, Carlos Gulbenkian Foundation, and Lynn Davis, who has been working with us as content coordinator for this initiative on education for shared societies, and she's also Professor Emeritus of International Education in the University of Birmingham. Ms. Campbell, Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's a delight to be here and to be part of this conversation about shared societies and the role that education plays in them. If we go back to the beginning of this project, one of the fundamental comments we made was that 90% of the countries of the world have minorities of at least 10%. But in paraphrasing Tolstoy's opening of Anna Karenina, each multicultural country, or I guess I'm going to get into trouble here. I was going to say that each multicultural country has its own version of that diversity, and I'll talk a little bit from the Canadian experience in a second. But I was asked to address this issue that in most countries, education is governed by regional and local governments, not so much by the central government. And the question is there a role for a global organization to engage with countries in talking about education, where in fact the regional and local levels of government are more involved? And I would say simply this, that in most countries, whether they are centralized or federalized or devolved in any way, the organizations, the policymakers that deal with education come together in regional and national meetings. So you have the Canadian School Trustees Association, you have school trustees meeting in each province, you have teachers and teachers associations. There are bodies that a global organization can interact with to engage on the issue of educating for a shared society, for sharing the results of our own findings, our own research, our own insights, the best practices that we may have learned from some of the examples that have been given in this meeting this week. I think of the very interesting presentation that Chandrika Kumaratungra gave yesterday about the work that she has done in Sri Lanka. And again, different countries have different forms of multiculturalism or diversity. And so it isn't a one-size-fits-all set of appropriate programs. But I think we should realize that the fact that education may be, dealt with by subnational orders of government does not mean that they cannot be accessed. A second thing I would say is that the internet provides many opportunities for sharing educational experiences, and we all know about Coursera and all of these different university courses. For the last 4 years, I've been involved as the founding principal of the Peter Lougheed Leadership College at the University of Alberta, and my contract is done now, which is why I'm free to rejoin the Club of Madrid and all of its activities. But one of the things that I learned when we were dealing with the Public Service of Canada, looking at possible shared educational experiences, is that for many people now, learning online isn't even full courses or isn't even, hour-long talks, that they are sort of short, succinct exercises with some kind of pedagogical value, some kind of content that people often access actually on their smartphones, not even their tablets or their laptops. So we think about, you sit here at the laptop and you plug it in and you get a course or a MOOC or something. But the possibilities of transmitting knowledge using online media is really quite significant now. And there's a lot of thinking, a lot of knowledge about how to make it effective. So you can link with communities, again, even bypassing educational structures and bodies by communicating directly with people who might benefit by the knowledge. And if we think about the horrible things that people get when they go online and they get referred by YouTube to some conspiracy site, the antidote to that is to have things online that in fact are constructive educational experiences. But I want to say a couple of other things about education for a shared society. In the Peter Leahy Leadership College, I designed the program, and around answering the question, what do leaders need to know? And in the first year, the course Foundations of Leadership, we did a lot of work on using the social and cognitive psychology about how we think. And one of the things that we've learned is the way we think isn't really how we think. And we all bring many cognitive biases to the processing of information. And educating for a shared society, one of the things that people need, I think, is a sense of self-awareness to understand the limits of their own perceptions. The landscape from which we get our sense of how the world works inculcates into us what psychologists call implicit attitudes. The attitudes, the visceral responses to things that may often be in conflict with our conscious attitudes. We may think, for example, that a woman could be president or prime minister, but if we've never seen a woman in that role, viscerally we may find a person who looks or sounds like a woman incongruous with that role. And so much of educating for shared societies is overcoming people's sense that certain kind of people don't belong or don't get to do certain things, that they are different, that they're not as good as we are. So we have to understand that it's not just a question of teaching tolerance or exposing people to different kinds of people. It's also understanding how we ourselves develop cognitively to not accept people who are different from us. In the college, we created small groups of students that we engineered for diversity. We made them as different as possible. And really one of the whole themes of the 2-year program is the exposure to people who don't think like you. The maximizing of diversity, and also understanding that diversity has a value. There is a lot of science now that points out the value of diversity. When we talk about, when Zlatko Lagumcha was talking about the fact that we know that shared societies are actually better societies when they work properly, when people are included, that they're actually more prosperous, that they actually make better decisions. There's lots of science to prove this. But it doesn't happen automatically. You need skills. So when we talk about educating for a shared society, there are so many different levels. What Chandrika was talking about yesterday in her society, where people from different communities don't have the opportunity to interact, bringing those people together for the first time to understand the humanity of each other was an amazing step. But there are also situations where people do live in diverse societies and they do interact or see people of different communities, but they still don't understand. And so I think it's really important to look at the different ways in which we connect with one another. So I also want to make the point that we've just gone through a very interesting exercise in Canada, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about the experience of our Indigenous people in residential schools, which was a terrible experience, and children scooped up, taken away from their families, and and there was abuse. It was just a terrible thing. And we are now trying in Canada to fulfill the recommendations that came from that very heart-rending experience, to try and make it up, in a sense, to the members of our Indigenous communities who suffered that. And I went to a program that was on this issue, and the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, Queen's representative of British Columbia, gave a lovely little talk where she talked about she just spent some time with some First Nations war veterans. Now, if you live in Canada, grew up in Canada, I'm the daughter of 2 World War II veterans. I'm a post-war baby boomer, and I often talk about the fact that both my parents were in uniform in World War II, how it influenced me. But you will not see in all of the discussions of World War II very much, if any, representation of First Nations people who, even though they didn't have full citizenship rights, signed up and went and fought in the Canadian Armed Forces. If we are going to have a more inclusive future, a more inclusive society going forward, we have to have a more inclusive history, because one of the challenges to creating functioning shared societies is that often people in our societies are invisible. We know with respect to women, people, that moron at Google who wrote the memo about women not being cut out for tech, and every time I find some wonderful reference to some brilliant woman scientist or mathematician or somebody who was doing it years ago and nobody's ever heard of her, but she was totally brilliant, I always tweet it out and I say, too bad women aren't cut out for tech. But it's this invisibility. So part of the education for a shared society involves looking at that society and recognizing the contributions that people make. I see people say, well, the Islamophobes, well, what have Muslims ever contributed to modern society? And I go, well, mathematics, algebra, we are not doing computation with Roman numerals, people, Arabic numbers. But if you don't know, then you have a view that excludes. So when we are looking at the role that we play as global organizations, fostering that better kind of understanding history, celebrating the contributions that people have made, even when it doesn't necessarily suit the historical vision of a dominant group in a society, to recognize that. So understanding ourselves, understanding that we all bring the capacity to be exclusionary, the capacity to be bigoted, because we're all products of an environment, products of something that it tells us how the world works. So we have to look into ourselves and we have to understand that we have this way of thinking, not because we're bad, but because we're human. That we have to open up our understanding of our own history, but that we also have to reach out to those who are working with young people. And I had a great discussion, I'll just conclude with this. Joe Malone, who was our facilitator yesterday in our lab, works for the Tony Blair Foundation. She does a wonderful program, not unlike what Chandrika was talking about, but she does it using the internet and people coming together by Skype on the internet, creating a safe space. So it's not even in a classroom. Teachers don't have to use their classroom, but they're working with teachers and breaking down barriers between young people. There are these technologies, but going to the organizations of teachers, the organizations of school trustees, the meetings of ministers of education, and you can hear more about that from my colleague here. There are these resources that we can share, and I think for the Club of Madrid, our job is not to be the consultants on education. Our job is to carry the broader message. This is why it matters, that shared societies are integral, successful shared societies are integral to the survival of democracy. And what we believe in is democracy. So I think we have that role to play, but I think we have to see the many different levels on which shared understanding the importance of shared societies and being able to deliver them plays out in education.
Thank you very much, Kim. I have to confess I have a professional disease. Having worked a lot of years in schools, to speak I have to stand. So allow me to do it standing. Well, I was asked to act a little bit as a critical friend, in the sense that looking to the work that we've been doing on the last couple of days and also the previous work of the Club de Madrid on this shared agenda, to try to find some missing links, some blind spots, and also some relevant actors that were not present in this debate. So I will leave you with you 7 challenges and way forward. First one is to recall you the famous outcome of a big conference on inclusive education that said, nothing about us without us. So I'm asking, shouldn't we be more active involving the voice of the children themselves, constructing this agenda? What about if we launch through the Club de Madrid members national or regional or local debates where we can involve actively children and youth and migrant and refugee population drafting this agenda? Because this agenda is not only for policymakers at the global level. This agenda is to be meaningful to communities at the ground level. So I would leave with you this first challenge. The second one is, if it's not online, it doesn't exist. we've discussed a lot about the role of ICT. We've discussed a lot about, you know, the dangers that are associated with fake news, etc. And I got some comments yesterday during the lunch break. People saying me, why isn't this public? Why isn't this meeting more open for public, for ministers to come and to assist, to work directly? Why don't we open this discussion? It's so rich, the debate. There's so much knowledge, so much talent, so much experience in that room. Why can we not open it? And I think this is clearly a missing link in our strategy. And you know, for me, these couple of days, these last 2 days, they were in a way a lesson not only on humanity, because of the powerful stories that were told here, but also a lesson on humankind, which is the power of talking with each other, the power of speaking to each other. And this is contrasting with the tendency, with the trend of online meetings and distance learning, which is there, it's true, but we have a power here, which is the power to speak with each other and to come up with different views about things. The third challenge, it's more a technical one. I was commenting yesterday with Professor Lin that these recommendations that we're now producing, they are broad. And they were made to be broad. Because we're trying, you know, to come up with something that is valuable in very, very different contexts. But for this to be true, we have to make it tangible for these different contexts. We have to come up with key or core indicators. How do I know if what I'm doing as a school principal is aligned with the shared societies? How do I know if I'm, as a local manager, a mayor, or even a minister, how do I know if I'm promoting shared societies? How can I see those recommendations in a tangible way that I can use in my own work, in my own policies, in my own decisions that I take every day? The next one would be, please don't keep it simple. We've heard this a lot of times during these last 2 days. We've said, these are complex problems. We cannot solve it with simple solutions. That is true. That is so true. But usually, when we are overwhelmed with the reality, and of course this reality is overwhelming, we tend to oversimplify. And the Club de Madrid members are experts on this point. We know that the agenda, this global agenda that we are now producing with so rich recommendations, we know that they will not fit all different publics. We know that this message has to be shaped to different contexts and to different publics. May I ask you, Club de Madrid members, when you were in charge, which papers would you read first in the morning, the newspaper or a policy recommendation on shared societies, for example? We have to adapt this content, this so rich content, into different formats, into different audience, into different tools, so that we can cover the different levels. Or we can decide we will keep on the broad and the global discussion, and we can get examples. And that leads me to the next idea, which is not mine idea. Maybe the author is sitting in the room. I heard this yesterday in one of the action labs. Somebody was saying ideas like this are very good, but even better are projects, action in real terms. And I would see the Club de Madrid as a major catalyst of a network of doers, not only thinkers, a network of doers. Like it was said yesterday, a community of heroes that are every day trying to make it tangible, to make it real, an agenda for shared societies. Also, I would advise to get good evidence on what we're doing towards that agenda, or we and the agenda will perish. It is true that a lot of the behaviors, a lot of the values, a lot of the attitudes, a lot of the competences that we were discussing in the last couple of days are very, very hard to evaluate, to assess. It is difficult, but it's not impossible. Science has made a long road in the last decade, only in the last decade. a long road on how to assess. How do I know if I'm promoting the right values? How do I know if my local plan is working? How do I know if the agenda, in the end, is working? How do I know if we are getting closer to shared societies in our own contexts? And the last, but not the least, is coming back to policymakers, because the Club Madrid is basically a club of policymakers. You as policymakers, you do policy throughout your life, not only when you are in charge. You know that better than me. So we could ask, okay, is this only for policymakers? And the answer would be yes and no. It is true, if you look to the recommendations, and Professor Lean will go through it in more detail, you will see that a big part of that is about regulations. Yesterday I heard about regulation on inclusion of migrants, regulations on emergency education, regulations on digitalized economy, or digitalized democracy, regulations on moral compasses for IT companies. That is true. This is about policymakers. But also, as we heard João saying today, this is also about the teacher at the end of the day is with a lot of students in his classroom and he needs support. So I would say, yes, we have to make the case for policymakers, but we should not forget, or we should not lose the opportunities to involve teachers, parents, community leaders, NGOs, civil society organizations, piloting what we are now writing in this document. And here I have the permission to say we are available as a foundation to help you on this effort. We are available to pilot this here in Portugal, for instance. And this is it, basically. Coming back to the assessment part, why do we need to assess this? Big discussion, but we have to be careful when we design these indicators for assessment, not to do what we want to assess, but to assess what we want to do. And this is a big, big risk when it comes to assessing soft skills or to assessing social change. Typically, and the school is a very good example of that, when we define indicators for performance, typically we follow the indicators and we forget about our vision, as it was just recently said. So coming back to the crafting, which is the title of this panel, if we think about crafters, about the creators of something, it came to my mind the example of the sculpture. The sculptor of a statue does his job as a creator, but the real life of the sculpture starts when he finishes his job. And I would say that the real life of the agenda starts when we finish this discussion and we put it on a paper. Thank you very much.
I'm just looking behind. Excellent. Good morning, everybody, and it's a very, I think, important panel now, taking this, crafting the agenda forward. I used to be a primary teacher, and I remember giving my class a task of writing a book review. They were little ones. Kevin wrote, "This book told me more about penguins than I wanted to know." And I hope in what I'm trying to do now, I don't tell you more than you wanted to know about the working groups. My task at this point is to try to bring together and to present the complex, not simple work that's been done on the working groups up till now. Behind the scenes, writing, preparing, getting the paper ready, consulting. It's a massive amount of work that's gone in, and you've seen different bits of it. I've tried to, bring that together in some way. I'm not sure it works. We're still working on, this is work in progress. We're trying to think about ways we can bring those together, find common things. So I'll run this past you and see what you think. And I really, really want feedback on this. Next. Just to remind, also, this You know, what are we doing, the indicators? We're trying to map all of this onto the principles that we all share, and I don't need even to read those out to you. We had the 3 working groups. Oh, I can see it here, can't I? Excellent. PVE, preventing violent extremism, refugees, migrants and refugees, and digital resilience. So I could have just presented the 3 sets of recommendations, but I'm trying to get a little bit beyond that this morning and see if we can find some common ground, what brings them together when we're thinking about policy recommendations. So now I had 6 areas, it could have been more. The first is that all 3 groups, parties, were talking in some way about collaboration and different sorts of collaboration, whether it's across the sectors, education, security, development, whether for refugees, of course, it's international communities of good practice. And with digital resilience, there's all sorts of collaborations that need to go on that we've heard about. So they've got this top level of how do we foster that collaboration. And again, I think this is a perfect arena for Club de Madrid people because you're already doing a lot of that. Inclusion. All 3 groups will be talking about inclusion in different ways. Whether for violent extremism, it's about community cohesion. We've talked about parents this morning already, involving parents and community. And making students feel included within the school. If they're excluded from school, we know that they're more vulnerable and more likely to find belonging in other sorts of movements, cults, groups, gangs, drugs, or whatever. Obviously, for migrants and refugees, inclusion that's the title of the working group. Lots of things around community language, a very complex area. It's not just about the language of the host country and so on, but complex issues around language and communication and how assimilation is defined. And we're going back to indicators here, which is an issue there. For digital resilience, it's bringing in the first session particularly, bringing in rural marginalised people through the use of ICT for learning. And of course, responsible digital citizenship, so that you are including people when you are communicating online in social media and not trolling and hate speech and excluding people through the way that was done. That was that lovely statistic, wasn't it? Most hate speech is done by women over the age of 55. I learn a lot of these events. Okay. Teacher training, obvious, no-brainer. For me, as a teacher educator, I'd always make this central. You can't do anything we've just heard. Teachers matter. None of us is going to disagree with that. The issue is, what do you get in your teacher training that enables you to do things, whether it's pre-service or in-service training. For violent extremism, absolute crucial need for teachers to be prepared to tackle these issues. A teacher, when there's a terrorist incident, a teacher who can respond to their class, explain, discuss, talk about it without scaring them even further. It's a skill not just about attacks, but anything that a teacher has to have the skills and the confidence to tackle confidential, controversial, sensitive issues without stereotyping even further or stigmatizing. Teaching about rights, it's a key area for Club de Madrid and shared societies, is shared rights. We had an argument yesterday about universal rights. Let's talk about shared rights. And the whole thing around open-mindedness and teaching for diversity. That's already happening in a lot of teacher training, but I think less goes on around teaching controversial issues. In teacher training, refugees and migrants, what comes out in that working paper is about training of refugee teachers, recognising qualifications and so on, and then training teachers in host countries about migration, about demography, about patterns, about what the needs are, about the whole spectrum of diversity that enables students to welcome and to understand. So there's a lot that needs to go in. The trouble is, of course, as we are realising, we are expanding the whole curriculum for teacher education, but I would dump a whole pile of stuff and have this in here. Digital resilience, we heard about ICT for learning, blended learning, and teacher training, obviously, for that. And teacher training in terms of enabling young people to build resilience to harmful messaging, being resilient to what they read, being resilient to what they see online, and whether it's everything from do you believe everything you read on Wikipedia. I think that was another interesting fact. I've forgotten what the 75% of young people somewhere thought that what they saw on advertisements was true. It's very basic stuff around fake news and disinformation which we need. Okay, that's number 3. I'm halfway through, bear with me. That leads into this whole question of anti-hate, and I think that cuts across those 3 areas. Challenging extremist hatreds, challenging hostility to migrants, hostility that is fed by politicians and by governments who are seeking votes, and that's got to be challenged at every level. And recognising challenging hate speech in digital resilience, it goes on from that previous area. Again, then that leads into being in a technological world. That again cut across how radicalisers are using the internet. I talked about yesterday about programs of enabling kids to recognise how they're being manipulated through video, film, pictures, images, music. It's a lot of very catchy music in radicalisers on ISIS, Al-Daesh websites, which is really, really trendy. And it really gets into your head. Digital connectivity when you talk with refugees, about refugees, and again, digital literacy that's another area that's happening in the camps and so on, that it's not just about keeping there, but of preparing people who are in the camps for the digital world, and ICT for learning. And the 2 sides that the workshop working group yesterday, the 2 sides of it, ICT for learning, the very positive things that you can do to bring people together, and then also understanding the dark side. The 6th one, close to my heart again, the need for more research. We all say this, but I think we do need to actually set this up rather than just say we need more evidence and need more research. I would put my neck out here and say I think Club de Madrid should actually set up research funds or projects that have their name on it. Everybody says we need to know what works. We know something about what works. We know a lot about what doesn't work. We know a lot about the disasters that we've tried in various effectiveness schools and everything else. But we need masses of more work, nuanced work around understanding what works. There are some reviews, but more needs to be done. It was interesting learning about, when we're talking about migrants and refugees, research which will demonstrate the benefits, the economic benefits of migrants and immigrants in a country. Everyone here understands that, but it's the work of convincing, which we've also heard about this morning. And the impact of conflict. We know a lot about the impact of conflict on education systems, but the whole thing changes daily and it needs to be updated. And we need research on, I don't think we understand fully, do we, how young people are really, really using social media. We see young people on their phones, tablets. We think we have an understanding, but it's very complex in terms of how they're actually communicating. And there's some wonderful projects of young people campaigning, using phones, using SMS messaging to connect to each other across the world. And I think we need more research which demonstrates the power of young people and peer-to-peer learning, peer-to-peer messaging. We moan a lot about the dark side, but I think we need more research that says, look, what's possible with very small amounts of funds for young people to collaborate. Okay, now this is where I'm getting into. Isn't that pretty? I'm trying to say I'm putting the three things together, and I'm trying to say what are these key things that are there. I've left out a whole pile of stuff. My apologies to the working group leaders that it's been possible to bring the richness of what has happened, but the papers will be available in the final agenda. It seems to me that you've got things that, again, I'm cutting across in different ways here. Doesn't matter where you start. Knowledge, it isn't just about, values are very important, but there is a basic knowledge component which is very needed, and we've heard about that. Knowledge of conflict in one's own society, not somewhere else. And you have issues of kids who learn about conflict in any other society but their own, and are not given the tools to understand why people are excluded, why people hate each other, why people pretend to like each other. So I think there's a whole pile of knowledge components which have to be there in the curriculum about equity, rights, conflict and exclusion to enable young people to understand their world. I'll go around the obvious ones, I don't need to do it. Critical thinking, the search for evidence, that cuts across everything. Education for rights, respect, diversity, cuts across everything. How technology gets used, and again, I'm repeating myself here about controversial issues. But it seems to me that you can, what we call picking the low-hanging fruit, that you can tackle a whole pile of areas by making sure that all of those things are present. And they come through in all of the working group papers to show that these are, for me, and I hope I'm representing the working group leaders correctly, these are there. This didn't work. Hang on a minute. Don't go away. Here we are. What unifies is, I'm playing about with the idea, is belonging a unifying concept which cuts across all those 5 areas? I don't know. Belonging comes through very clearly in a lot of the Club de Madrid literature. The shared society is at root where people feel they belong. And I'm thinking that if you can do all of those things, you're increasing that sense of belonging because you know about things, you're able to talk about it, you're able to dialogue. You can use technology to bring people in and not to exclude. Belonging is about shared rights and knowing that everybody is able to access their rights in a society. So I'm trying to find unifying themes that will enable, not to make it too simple, because I know it's difficult, but nonetheless we need to have something that isn't just an agenda with 546 recommendations. So we've got to find these themes, these standout things that will enable that to happen. One more slide, if you bear with me. And well, it keeps doing that. See how technological. It was all right on my computer. Right, what's the change process? I won't go into this, but it's, again, deciding where things happen. Do you have to do the policy legislation first before you do anything else? But I don't think you can just say there should be more teacher education. There's got to be something above that says, yes, in our teacher education colleges, in our schools, this is going to happen. So in a sense, it's got to come from the top. Although there are many good, this is why I put INGOs and NGOs and non-formal also into that chart, because there are lots of initiatives which go directly into teacher training, teacher education colleges. It doesn't have to come from the top. So the decision is always the starting points. Do you think we need always to have a law on this, or can you just inject and sort it out from the bottom? What the feminists used to call white anting. You know, you've got the hill and you burrow away underneath. So I won't go into that, but these are decisions that need to be made about the change process, breaking down segregation, inclusion, and how that links together in different ways. So I'll finish, no, I won't finish, yes, I will just do the last slide. I'm a great believer in nudge and behavioural economics. So I'm going to say to you, what's the one thing you can do very soon to nudge somebody or an organisation to effect a change? So I'm now going to ask the working group leaders, are we all right for time? I've rabbited on. 2 minutes each to pick out, what did we say? 1, 2 take-home messages from your working group that you want us to remember.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for trying to summarize a lot of recommendations into a very short time. So you can read I'm from the Preventing Violent Extremism Working Group. You can read our policy recommendations so far in the papers. But 2 takeaways, very practical takeaways from the Action Labs yesterday that I want to highlight. The first one, actually 1 overall point and then 2 takeaways. The overall point is I think we need to make sure that we're not securitizing the education sector. That was emphasized by most of the working group members yesterday. So when we're talking about preventing violent extremism, let's not make the education sector part of the counterterrorism sector, which I definitely agree to. So the two key takeaways. The first one is cross-cultural experiences between ethnicities and religions, for example, both in the formal and the informal space, can work on the drivers of radicalization as well as the narratives of exclusion. And so I think we had some good examples from Generation Global and also from Her Excellency Kamaratunga of work that's being done in Sri Lanka on different communities coming together and sharing experiences and students sharing experiences across those dividing lines. And then the second main point is on the need for resources for teachers on preventing violent extremism. And that comes through several things. One, training on skills that build values and resilience in students, and that includes social and emotional learning, safe spaces for discussion. So ensuring that teachers have the skill sets to build those values, and then as well as materials and activities through curriculum books, that sort of thing, and networks of teachers for sharing information on PVE across different contexts and finding shared solutions in that way. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, admirably pithy. I'll try to emulate. Selina Victor from the Inclusive Education for Refugees, IDPs and Migrants Working Group. And it was a rich and wide-ranging discussion and hard to summarize. But I thought it was particularly useful to hear from both the leaders and the experts about the realities of implementing really good policy in this area. It's very clear that we can't effectively provide inclusive education for refugees, IDPs and migrants without improving the quality and quantity of education more generally, but that is not enough. The challenges are very clear. I think there's a lot of consensus in this room. The systems that are already overstretched, communities with particular needs, not least the profound stress and trauma that they may have experienced, issues around language, culture, integration, and particularly the huge challenges that flow from the negative perception of refugees and migrants and the way this is being used by some people for their own ends. But it is remarkable, and this came out very much in the conversation afterwards, that actually despite this environment, we have seen huge progress in terms of commitments. The Global Compact for Refugees, the New York Declaration, have really comprehensive recommendations around education. The most recent UN General Assembly was hailed as really quite a success in this area. And it's actually something of a miracle that we have this, that it's still moving forward, that nobody's pulled out, that it still looks like it's going to go ahead. But we need to maintain that momentum and make sure it's made real at the regional level, at the national level. And this is a clear role, and I think I heard some volunteers from the Club de Madrid in championing that set of commitments, that set of resolutions for change, bringing new stakeholders into that discussion, bringing in the private sector, making sure the development actors are doing their part, holding governments to account for those pledges. But then more broadly, I think there's a clear role for the Club de Madrid, perhaps linked to the research agenda. We need visionary leaders who are willing to shift the debate on this, who aren't willing to accept the negative discourse around refugees and migrants. President Krasniewski made the very good point that this is a fact of our future. while that may cause a lot of short-term pain in terms of the rise of populism and nationalism, in the long term, that's to the benefit of societies, and we need visionary leaders who are willing to make that case. Thank you.
Thank you. Sean Carroll filling in for Andrew Cunningham, who is the facilitator for Working Group 3, Resilience, Digital Resilience for Education for Shared Societies. He wasn't feeling well today. We talked a lot about the opportunity for the value and the opportunity for access that ICT for learning for shared societies provides. We talked about the importance of good pedagogy, teacher training in digital learning. And then some specific ideas that came out. We're starting in terms of digital resilience, starting earlier, working with children and teachers earlier in life and in the education track on digital resilience. We talked about artificial intelligence and the fact that whether the outcomes from machine learning are good or bad depend on the human input. And we heard a couple of good examples. Amazon used some machine learning to do hiring and realized that the machines learned how to be biased in their hiring just as humans had been before. We heard a good example from Finland, Sommerturva, using machine learning, artificial intelligence to connect lawyers and legal processes with victims or potential victims of online harassment. We talked about peer-to-peer, that maybe learning about digital resilience will have more effect, more traction if it comes from peers. But we also talked about the importance of adults and people who are close to youth who may be, or people who may be at risk, vulnerable to online manipulation, and how do we treat adults who may be close to them to recognize the signs and the symptoms. We talked about the divide later, the digital divide being not about access, but about who can create technology, so the importance of teaching, coding, and the creation of technology. There was a question about which ICT will bring people together, will actually promote cohesion. We talked about local policies, that each country situation is different and policies need to be local. And finally, Prime Minister Radikova mentioned a meeting she had with leaders of the top technology companies, and they pleaded, the group of political leaders, and it could have been the group of Club of Madrid leaders, for a moral compass. They said, we need a moral compass. Please work with us to provide that. And we talked about the importance of together building a digitalized democracy. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Again, it's so hard, isn't it? I've got to go back over here. To do all these things in a short space of time. But I just want to reiterate, I think, appreciation of the work of the working groups and their working group leaders and the people who've contributed. And it will continue. It hasn't finished this dialogue. The papers will be extended and form part of the final agenda. So, of course, you'll look forward to reading those in more depth and getting a feel of the richness in the work that's been done. So I just want to end by thanking the working groups and thanking those working group leaders for the work that they are doing and will continue to do. So thank you very much, and thank you all very much for listening. I'm afraid there's no time for questions because it's coffee. Is that right? Do you want to finish?
We'll have a coffee break now, same place as yesterday, strike and likely to delay, and we are reconvening in 20 minutes. Thank you.